Have you ever met someone who smiles politely, speaks very little, watches everything, and somehow makes you feel like they already know more than they've said? Most people underestimate that person. They mistake silence for weakness, distance for arrogance, calmness for emptiness. But sometimes silence is what remains after 1,000 battles no one ever witnessed. Today, we're talking about a rare kind of person, not someone born extraordinary, but someone shaped by pressure, molded by disappointment, and transformed by experiences that would have broken most people. These are the trauma-born empath loners. They don't avoid the crowd because they hate people. They step away because they've learned that not everyone deserves access to their peace. Pain taught them what comfort never could. They've learned to read the slightest change in someone's voice. They notice what others ignore. They sense intentions before words are spoken. Not because they possess some magical gift, but because survival demanded that level of awareness. When life forces you to constantly predict danger, your mind begins collecting tiny details everyone else overlooks. Over time, this becomes second nature. The world calls them quiet. Reality is, they're simply listening to everything no one else hears. But here's the danger. The same sensitivity that helps them understand people can also become the prison that traps them. They absorb emotions that aren't theirs. They carry burdens they never created. They forgive too often, trust too carefully, and disappear into isolation because protecting their energy feels safer than risking another betrayal. That's why so few truly make it, not because they're weak, because carrying invisible weight every single day slowly drains even the strongest spirit. Yet those who survive discover something remarkable. They stop seeking approval. They stop explaining themselves. They stop chasing people who never valued them. Instead, they build something far more powerful, a life directed by clarity rather than fear. So if you've ever felt like the outsider, the observer, the one who understands everyone but feels understood by no one, this message is for you. Because what you're about to hear isn't about becoming someone new. It's about recognizing the strength you've been carrying all along, the strength that hardship tried to destroy, but accidentally forged into your greatest advantage. Stay with me until the end, because the difference between surviving your past and allowing it to define your future comes down to a few decisions that almost nobody talks about. Most people assume that when someone leaves, it happens after one big fight, one dramatic betrayal, or one unforgettable moment. But with an empath, that's almost never how the story unfolds. The ending begins long before anyone notices it. It starts with the small moments that seem insignificant to everyone else. A promise that was casually broken, a truth that was carefully hidden, a feeling that was quietly dismissed. Individually, these moments don't appear powerful enough to destroy a relationship. Together, they become a pattern, and patterns speak louder than apologies. An empath rarely expects perfection. They understand that people make mistakes. They know everyone has bad days, moments of weakness, and flaws that occasionally surface. In fact, they're often the first person to offer understanding when everyone else has already passed judgment. They will search for reasons behind someone's behavior instead of rushing to condemn it. They'll ask themselves whether the other person is overwhelmed, exhausted, or carrying pain they haven't shared. That ability to see beyond the surface is one of their greatest strengths. Ironically, it can also become the very reason they stay in unhealthy situations far longer than they should. The problem begins when kindness is mistaken for endless tolerance. There are people who slowly realize they can apologize without changing. They notice they can cross boundaries and still be forgiven. They become comfortable taking more than they give, because the empath keeps believing tomorrow will be different. Every excuse becomes another opportunity. Every broken promise receives another chance. Every disappointment is softened by hope. What looks like patience from the outside slowly becomes emotional exhaustion on the inside. Trust is not a single decision. It's a collection of experiences stored quietly in the mind. Every honest conversation adds another brick to the foundation. Every act of consistency makes that foundation stronger, but every betrayal removes one of those bricks. The damage isn't always visible at first because the structure still stands. That's why many people assume everything is fine. They don't realize that the support underneath has already started disappearing. An empath notices details most people overlook. They remember changes in tone. They notice when actions no longer match words. They recognize when enthusiasm becomes obligation and affection becomes convenience. They pay attention to the pauses between sentences, the delayed replies, the promises that slowly stop becoming reality. They aren't searching for flaws. Their mind has simply learned to connect patterns because patterns often reveal what words are trying to hide. This is why repeated betrayal hurts so deeply. It's not only about what happened, it's about what each repeated incident communicates. Every broken promise quietly says, "My comfort matters more than your trust." Every lie whispers, "I believe I can hide the truth because you'll probably forgive me." Every act of manipulation sends the message that honesty isn't considered necessary. These messages accumulate until they become impossible to ignore. What's fascinating is that the empath rarely announces this realization. There isn't always a confrontation filled with accusations. There isn't always a dramatic speech explaining every disappointment. By the time they fully understand the pattern, they've already spent countless nights thinking about it. They've replayed conversations in their mind. They've questioned their own judgment. They've wondered whether they were expecting too much. They've searched for evidence that they might be wrong because they would rather discover they misunderstood than accept that someone they cared about consistently chose dishonesty. That internal struggle is exhausting. Imagine carrying two voices inside your mind every single day. One says, "People deserve another chance." The other quietly replies, "How many chances become permission?" That conflict can last for months or even years. During that time, the empath continues showing up, continues caring, continues hoping. To everyone else, nothing seems different. But inside, a decision is slowly forming. Here's what many people misunderstand. The empath doesn't suddenly stop caring. They stop believing. Those are two completely different things. Caring is emotional. Belief is built on evidence. Once enough evidence points in the same direction, belief changes. And when belief changes, behavior inevitably follows. This is why the final goodbye often surprises the other person. They expected another conversation, another warning, another opportunity to explain themselves. Instead, they encounter something unfamiliar: silence. Not angry silence designed to manipulate, peaceful silence created by acceptance. The empath has finally stopped negotiating with reality. They've accepted that someone's repeated actions reveal more than carefully chosen words ever could. There is incredible strength hidden inside that moment. Walking away isn't easy for someone who naturally wants to repair relationships. It goes against their instinct to nurture, understand, and forgive. Leaving requires them to override habits they've carried for years. It requires choosing self-respect over emotional attachment. It requires accepting that loving someone does not obligate them to remain where trust no longer exists. Many people mistake this quiet departure for emotional coldness. In reality, it's often the opposite. It happens because the empath has reached the limit of what their heart can safely carry. Continuing to stay would require ignoring their own emotional well-being. It would demand pretending that repeated betrayal has no consequences. Eventually, preserving their peace becomes more important than preserving a relationship that only survives through endless forgiveness. Once that decision is made, something remarkable begins to happen. The energy that was once spent worrying about another person's choices starts returning to its rightful owner. The constant anxiety fades. The endless mental replay of conversations becomes quieter. The need to decode every mixed signal disappears because distance provides clarity that proximity never could. Sometimes the greatest answer isn't another explanation. Sometimes it's recognizing that consistency has already revealed everything necessary. People often believe trust can always be rebuilt with enough apologies. But apologies without consistent action slowly lose their meaning. Genuine trust isn't restored through emotional speeches. It's rebuilt through repeated honesty, dependable behavior, and respect demonstrated over time. Without those things, words become background noise. The empath eventually stops listening to promises and starts believing only patterns. And that is why repeated betrayal carries such lasting consequences. It doesn't simply damage a relationship. It changes how safe someone feels within it. Once safety disappears, closeness becomes difficult. Once respect disappears, connection becomes fragile. And once trust is replaced by constant doubt, even love struggles to survive. When an empath quietly walks away, it is rarely because of one mistake. It is because they finally recognized that what kept hurting them wasn't an isolated moment. It was a pattern that had been asking for acceptance far longer than it deserved. There is a difference between being kind and becoming someone's emotional shelter. At first, the line is almost invisible. An empath naturally listens when someone is struggling. They stay on the phone longer than they planned. They answer late-night messages. They remember the conversations everyone else forgets. They notice when someone's smile looks forced, when a laugh sounds empty, or when a simple, "I'm fine," carries the weight of something much heavier. Helping feels natural to them because they don't see compassion as an obligation. They see it as part of who they are. The problem begins when that generosity slowly transforms into expectation. Without realizing it, some people stop appreciating the empath's presence and start depending on it in unhealthy ways. Every emotional crisis suddenly becomes the empath's responsibility to solve. Every disappointment is brought to them. Every difficult decision is placed in front of them. Every moment of uncertainty becomes another reason to lean on the one person who always seems willing to carry the weight. What started as kindness quietly turns into emotional labor that is never acknowledged because it has become normal. An empath rarely keeps score. They don't count every favor, every hour spent listening, or every sacrifice made behind the scenes. Their satisfaction comes from knowing they helped someone feel less alone. That is why emotional exploitation often develops so gradually. There is no single moment where they decide to give everything away. Instead, they give a little more each day until one morning they realize they have been pouring from a cup that has almost nothing left inside. Many people misunderstand emotional exhaustion because it leaves no visible evidence. There are no bruises, no dramatic signs that announce what has been happening beneath the surface. Yet the mind grows tired in ways the body cannot hide forever. Conversations that once felt meaningful begin to feel heavy. Constant reassurance becomes draining instead of rewarding. Even simple messages can create a sense of pressure because every notification carries the possibility of another emotional emergency waiting to be solved. What makes this especially difficult is that the empath often blames themselves first. They wonder if they're becoming selfish. They question why they're feeling irritated by requests they once welcomed. They convince themselves they should have more patience because other people have it worse. Instead of recognizing that their boundaries have been crossed, they criticize themselves for feeling exhausted. This internal conflict keeps them trapped longer than anyone realizes. Emotional exploitation is rarely loud. It doesn't always involve manipulation that is obvious or cruel. Sometimes it appears in much quieter forms. One person only reaches out when they need advice but disappears when the empath needs support. Another expects endless understanding while offering very little in return. Someone else constantly unloads their frustration without ever asking how the empath is doing. None of these moments seem devastating on their own. Yet repeated often enough, they create a relationship where one person is constantly giving while the other is constantly receiving. Healthy relationships breathe in both directions. Care moves back and forth. Support is shared. Respect grows through mutual effort. Emotional exploitation interrupts that balance. It teaches one person that their role is to absorb while the other simply releases. Over time, this creates an invisible imbalance that becomes impossible to ignore. The empath may still smile, still listen, and still encourage others, but deep inside they begin to notice something unsettling. They feel emotionally present in everyone else's life, while quietly disappearing from their own. One of the greatest strengths of an empath is their ability to understand pain without needing every detail explained. Ironically, this ability can attract people who are looking for relief rather than connection. They don't seek partnership, they seek emotional rescue. Setting boundaries feels uncomfortable at first because it challenges habits they have reinforced for years. Saying no feels unfamiliar. Delaying a response creates guilt. Choosing rest instead of rescuing someone else almost feels wrong. Yet each small boundary teaches an important lesson. Protecting your emotional energy is not an act of selfishness. It is an act of responsibility. No one can continue offering genuine compassion if they are permanently depleted. Something remarkable happens when an empath begins respecting their own limits. People who genuinely care about them adjust. They understand. They respect the boundary because their relationship was never dependent on unlimited access. Those who become angry, distant, or offended often reveal something important without realizing it. They were benefiting from the absence of boundaries, not celebrating the presence of the person. The empath begins seeing relationships with greater clarity. They no longer confuse constant availability with loyalty. They stop measuring love by how much pain they can absorb. They realize that sacrificing their mental peace does not make a relationship stronger. In many cases, it only teaches others that their emotional needs will always come first. As this awareness grows, the empath's behavior changes in subtle but powerful ways. They become more selective with their time. They no longer feel obligated to answer every call immediately or solve every problem presented to them. They learn that listening is valuable, but carrying someone else's entire emotional world is not their responsibility. Compassion remains part of who they are, yet it is now guided by wisdom instead of guilt. The people around them may notice the difference and mistake it for distance. In reality, the empath has not become colder. They have become healthier. Their kindness is no longer driven by fear of disappointing others. It is guided by discernment. They understand that real connection requires mutual respect, shared effort, and genuine care flowing in both directions. Eventually, the quiet withdrawal begins. It is not fueled by resentment or revenge. It grows from the realization that peace cannot exist where emotional imbalance has become normal. Rather than arguing about every disappointment or demanding appreciation that should never have required asking for, the empath simply invests less energy where it is never returned. Their attention shifts toward relationships where support is mutual, conversations feel safe, and kindness is appreciated instead of expected. In that quiet decision, they reclaim something far more valuable than approval from others. They reclaim ownership of their own emotional well-being, recognizing that the greatest act of compassion is not endlessly rescuing everyone else, but ensuring they no longer abandon themselves in the process. One of the greatest misunderstandings about an empath is the belief that they need constant praise or endless reassurance. The truth is often the opposite. Most empaths are not searching for someone who agrees with everything they say. They are searching for one thing that is much rarer, someone who genuinely sees them. They spend so much of their lives understanding other people that they quietly hope, perhaps without ever saying it aloud, that one day someone will offer them the same level of understanding in return. That hope keeps many relationships alive far longer than anyone realizes. But there is something that slowly erodes even the strongest hope, and it isn't disagreement. It isn't conflict. It isn't even criticism. It is repeated invalidation. It is the experience of speaking honestly about your thoughts or emotions, only to have them dismissed as an overreaction, ignored as unimportant, or twisted into something they never were. Each time it happens, a small part of trust begins to disappear. Invalidation rarely arrives in dramatic ways. It often hides inside ordinary conversations. Someone laughs while the empath is trying to explain why something hurt them. Another person changes the subject before their feelings have even been acknowledged. Sometimes they hear phrases like, "You're too sensitive," "You're imagining things," or "You're making a bigger deal out of this than it really is." These words may seem harmless to the person saying them, but over time they communicate a much deeper message. They suggest that the empath's inner world is not worthy of careful attention. At first, the empath usually gives the benefit of the doubt. They assume the other person didn't understand. They try explaining themselves again using different words. They become calmer, more patient, more careful with every sentence because they genuinely want to be understood rather than win an argument. They believe that if they communicate clearly enough, eventually the misunderstanding will disappear. But something begins to change when every sincere conversation leads back to the same place. The feelings are still dismissed. The concerns are still minimized. The vulnerability they offered is still treated like an inconvenience rather than a gift. Slowly, the empath starts asking themselves a difficult question. If someone truly cares about me, why do I always leave these conversations feeling smaller than when they began? That question stays with them. It follows them into quiet moments. It echoes after every interaction that leaves them feeling unheard. They replay conversations, wondering whether they expressed themselves poorly. They search for ways they could have been clearer. They question whether they expected too much. They almost always examine themselves before questioning someone else's intentions because self-reflection is one of their strongest habits. Unfortunately, this tendency can keep them trapped in unhealthy relationships. While they are busy analyzing their own words, they overlook a painful reality. Sometimes the problem isn't communication. Sometimes the other person simply isn't listening with the intention of understanding. They're listening only long enough to defend themselves, change the subject, or dismiss the concern altogether. An empath notices emotional consistency. They recognize whether someone makes room for another person's experiences or only values conversations that revolve around themselves. They begin to see patterns that once seemed isolated. Every interrupted sentence, every dismissed concern, every joke made at the wrong moment. Every time their emotions were treated as excessive rather than respected. Eventually, these moments connect into a picture that becomes impossible to ignore. There is a profound difference between someone disagreeing with your perspective and someone refusing to acknowledge that your feelings exist. Healthy relationships allow room for different opinions while still respecting emotional reality. Invalidation removes that respect. It quietly teaches one person that expressing themselves has consequences. The result is predictable. They begin speaking less. This silence is often misunderstood. Others assume the empath has finally accepted the situation or moved on. In reality, something entirely different is happening. They are observing. They are measuring whether honesty is still safe. Every time they choose not to express another feeling, they are gathering information. They are discovering whether anyone notices the silence they never wanted to create. Most people think relationships end during arguments. For an empath, they often begin ending during moments of quiet. The conversations become shorter. The explanations become fewer. They stop bringing up the issues that once mattered deeply because experience has taught them exactly how those conversations will end. Not with understanding, not with empathy, but with dismissal. This change is subtle enough that many people never recognize it until it is too late. They assume everything is peaceful because conflict has disappeared. They mistake silence for contentment. They fail to realize that the empath has simply stopped investing emotional energy where it repeatedly produces disappointment. What makes this especially significant is that an empath does not stop feeling. They simply stop sharing those feelings with the person who continually invalidated them. Their emotional world remains just as. So, if there's one lesson to remember, it's this. An empath doesn't disappear because of a single mistake. They disappear because of repeated choices. A broken promise that was never repaired. A kindness that was constantly taken for granted. A heart that kept speaking until it realized no one was truly listening. People often believe they'll see the moment an empath decides to leave. The truth is, that moment usually happened long before the goodbye. It happened the day they stopped expecting honesty. It happened the day they realized their compassion had become someone else's convenience. It happened the day they understood that protecting their peace was no longer selfish. It was necessary. The quietest people often make the loudest decisions, not because they seek revenge, not because they want attention, but because they finally understand that peace is worth more than proving their value to people who never appreciated it in the first place. And maybe that's the real message here. Every relationship teaches you something. Some teach you how to trust. Others teach you where your boundaries should have been. The strongest people aren't the ones who can endure endless pain. They're the ones who know exactly when it's time to stop carrying what was never theirs to carry. So if this message spoke to you, don't just think about the people in your life. Think about yourself. Ask yourself one honest question. Are you building relationships where respect, honesty, and understanding flow both ways, do? Or are you slowly disappearing just to keep someone else comfortable? Because the moment you begin choosing yourself, respect over endless self-sacrifice, everything changes. And sometimes, the most powerful move you'll ever make is the one you never have to announce. If this message gave you a new perspective, let it stay with you long after this video ends. Share it with someone who needs the reminder that kindness should never require losing yourself. And if you're ready for more insights into human behavior, emotional strength, and the hidden patterns that shape our lives, stay connected. Because the next conversation might reveal something you've been overlooking